Thank you very much for that. I'm particularly appreciative of your injecting the private sector perspective in how this isn't simply an intergovernmental issue. I'd like to open it up now to the floor. I'm particularly interested in comments that or reflections on the status of global governance as you see it, in taking stock in it. This question of, again, how the rising emerging powers versus established powers plays into the type of global governance we might see going forward, and then and also this question of leadership. Yes, please.
Thank you, John. Peter Jankovic. I'm a former ambassador to various multilateral organizations, United Nations, OECD, etc. So I'm very interested in your subject, and let me briefly answer some points of your, to the issues you raised. First, on the state of global governance, I think that the present state of global government, particularly if one looks at the United Nations and specialized agencies, which are a very huge and very carefully prepared network after 1945, the situation is not too good because there has been for many, many years now a reluctance of many governments, both to developed and developing countries, to create new, powerful new organizations which can deal with these new major challenges. We've just been talking about the environment, and there has been a call for a long time now to create an international environmental organization. There's a small UN office in Nairobi, but on the global scale, there's nothing. And the same applies for many other fields of where global governance seems to be necessary. And even the type of major international conferences that the United Nations used to run for some time, perhaps with the exception of climate, has now completely stopped. About huge conferences, for instance, on the question of women, conferences on other major internet, but all these have stopped because governments are afraid that they might be forced to draw some to accept new obligations, and so for that reasons there's a certain stagnation in global governments, at least as far as the United Nations is concerned. And on top of that, there's also a growing deficit in interagency cooperation. As I just mentioned, there are many important specialized agencies of the United Nations itself, but there's very little cooperation. There's very little interaction between these organizations. There are all kinds of interagency committees, but the efforts, to use all this combined wisdom, this critical mass is rather missing. The question you are raising is, of course, where might leadership come from? And of course, there have always been efforts to create a kind of countervailing power. It would be interesting, perhaps, in this context, to study the history of the non-aligned movement, which is forgotten now and which also perhaps has never been particularly effective. But strangely enough, it still exists. Not a single country so far has left it. Also, it has not been particularly effective. And also, the next year it will have a pretty big problem because the next non-aligned summit will meet in Tehran. So this will be quite an interesting thing. But this was an effort to create countervailing powers, the same as the Group of 77, of which also one hears very little today. So there's certainly some efforts to create countervailing power, to create new centers of leadership. In this context, you have sometimes efforts like those of Venezuela and creating regional and sub-regional organizations. But I mean, these things go on, and the question will be where are they going to end, and will they have any effect in the end? So I think these are some of the thoughts that come to mind if you ask these questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just comment on the non-aligned and G77? I mean, from a I co-authored a report on UN Security Council reform and U.S. national interests, and from a U.S. perspective, and again, this is very much a U.S. perspective, the G77 and the NAM, although you don't hear about them that often, are seen frequently as being sort of problematic and anachronistic, and sort of locked into Cold War / post-colonial mindsets in a way that is not particularly helpful or conducive to dealing with problems that of a new era in a way. And I realize that's a controversial statement, and if there were, or perhaps if there were more people here from that world, they might take me to task for that statement. But one of the questions about Security Council reform, for instance, is this question of if you actually had India or Brazil, for instance, on as a permanent member, how would they behave? Would they take a global view of their responsibilities? Again, this is from a U.S. perspective, or would they, in a sense, import mindsets that the U.S., again, from a U.S. perspective, would find problematic, despite being also democratic countries. So it's just again, reinforces the question of and the importance of values and as a determining factor with how countries look at some of these issues. I think you were next, and then.
Thank you very much. I think we had a very good introduction with these two interventions, giving somewhat the two sides of the coin, in a way. And this is giving a rather, I would say, appropriate description of this mix we are confronted with in terms of governance. I just would like to mention from my experience, I'm special representative of the European Union for Central Asia for the last 5 years. What strikes me is that you have not mentioned in this, I quote the Council of Foreign Relations, the components of global governance, and it didn't appear much in the evaluations of the present state of governance. It's social problems were mentioned, but migrations, and connected ethnic problems. I mean, we know that in Europe, look at Lampedusa and so on and so on. It's a full continent in motion, and we are not going to stop that through naval forces and so on. So we have a major problem of governance because it goes back to the village in the middle of Sahel. The other component is crime. I mean, the best governance today, I'm sorry, is with crime. You have about 20, 30 international criminal networks who have no problems with the border and who have been the first beneficiaries of globalization of the last 20 years. I mean, some argue that it is the equivalent of GNP of Sweden. Some say, well, it's much more than that, 10 times more. So, I mean, even the debate about the amount which is at stake, I'm mentioning that because I could see that through the heroin production from Afghanistan, which is just sweeping the Eurasian continent. I'm not an expert in the dimension of cocaine, but when I see that now we have to fight cocaine from Colombia, in Kenya, and through Somalia, I mean, you have the best example of globalization. I mean, they know how to manage, and they are far better than we will ever be in a way. And this, I think, is a rather disturbing element which we have to integrate in this thinking. Second, the point about the 158,000 conventions. Yes, indeed. And in your introduction, Patrick, you mentioned the Chemicals Convention. I was one of the negotiators. What I can see, I mean, how much it has weighed on the chemical industry. They were very reluctant at the beginning. It was a pain in the neck. But at the same time, we got it on board and say, well, you have already a problem with public opinions. They don't like chemical industry. If you in any way endure the risk of being taken by supposition into this field, you are killed. And so better for you to be on board. And in the end, it works. This is an international convention which is really forbidding, and for the whole, I mean, one can say it has been managed in the last 20 years, which means that 20 years ago, I mean, everybody was more or less convinced that chemical weapons were going to be the nuclear weapon of the poor. The question is not anymore there. So, in a way, I mean, we have this piling up of conventions. And if only to correct the point about this huge amount, look at our national laws. We have tens of thousands of laws which are either superseded or just disappearing. You have the same phenomenon. So we have an overload of legal attempts to manage a more complex reality. And we all complain in our parliaments that we are now making absurd or obsolescing laws in a matter of months. And everybody is crying and deploring that. But this is a wider social phenomenon where the quality of the law of the past is now more or less lost in a good measure of lawmaking in many countries. So we have a problem there.
Are you saying that because it's being superseded by law at the international level?
No, I'm saying that the phenomenon at the national level is exactly the same as the building of the conventions.
Okay, right.
I mean, as first, you see a problem, well, let's try to have a convention.
Right.
And this is incremental in a way. So it's a kind, maybe a sickness of postmodernity, who knows? But I mean, we have changed our vision of the law without measuring that, and the same for the convention in a way. I finish with this point you have described where the complexity is not manageable. Yes, but then in such cases, which are organizational problems, you have to come to subunits. You have to come to intermediate levels. You have too much moving at the top. Here, interesting, as you know, and this is also connected with the demonstrations and so on, you have the deglobalization movement. And of course, this is populist, this is elementary and so on. But in some cases, de-escalating the generalization is probably a pertinent question. And coming back to lower levels rather than just pushing up all the time the problem. And I think that here, some kind of ex post reflection after this first wave of globalization could be a direction in methodology. I would finish in mentioning something which has been striking for some kind of crisis management I've seen at lower level, Central Asia, Caucasus, and so on. It's the gathering of international organization. This is a rather interesting movement. In more or less what you recalled about April 2009, when you have a crisis, everybody recognizes is beyond reach and would stick together. And the case is also valuable for applied for the organization. I mean, be it this ethnic killings and crisis in Kyrgyzstan, it's limited, it's a small country, maybe. We decided 3 days after the revolution between EU, OSCE, and UN that it would work together, that would have a weekly meeting and so on. They have had now their third elections. They have a constitutional transfer of power to the new president in Central Asia, no precedent in the last 20 years. So I don't say we made it, but I mean, it was the recognition that we will all be criticized because the trend is to criticize international organization, but better to sit together because then we begin to manage something. And I think that around Afghanistan, post-2014, you will see the same. Because it's in a way going to be worse, but we are all entangled with people there risking to be killed by mobs and so on, and we'll have some new problems with Taliban. We cannot get out of it. We are committed. We have money which is earmarked. So this kind of sitting together and even going beyond just sitting together, what I would call mutualization. I mean, we speak a lot about mutualization in front of the euro crisis. It's painful and it's complicated, but I think it's more or less the trend. That is, we don't shape necessarily an authority. It has an ad hoc character, but it admits that on a real problem, lasting problem, we'll have to sit together and join forces for quite a long time.